Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. This is part 2 of a video series that I am recording about a very detailed expose that was published in the New York Times on Sunday, September 8th, 2024, about the battles and eventual coup d'etat that erupted between Bob Iger and Bob Chapek inside of the Walt Disney Company, as Chapek was becoming the company's new CEO while dealing with Iger's intense egotism and obsession with staying in absolute control.
All who gain power are afraid to lose it.
And while Chapek is by no means blameless in what transpired, it's very clear that Iger intended to use Chapek as a figurehead to do his bidding and eventually cast him as a scapegoat as things went sour. But the man behind all of it was master manipulator Bob Iger, with the approval of his rubber-stamping board of directors. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! In part 1 of this video series, I went over the first 4 subsections of the expose in the New York Times that's entitled The Palace Coup at the Magic Kingdom, with the subtitle The Inside Story of How Bob Iger Undermined and Outmaneuvered Bob Chapek, his chosen successor, and returned to power at Disney. And in part 1, I identified what I described as being 9 red flags that occurred as Bob Chapek was becoming Disney's CEO on February 25th, 2020, which I will list here as follows. Number 1, Chapek had to answer to both Iger and the board. Number 2, Iger's obvious reluctance to give up control, as exemplified by his rejection of Tom Staggs in 2016. Number 3, Iger's successful deal to purchase 20th Century Fox in 2017, and the board renewing Iger's contract as CEO after he seemingly approached Chapek about becoming Disney's next CEO. Number 4, Iger's personal wealth, power, and influence, and his obvious desire to maintain all 3. Number 5, a lack of normal business practices as Iger rushed the rubber-stamping board of directors to make Chapek CEO. Number 6, Chapek warned by Susan Arnold to not step on Iger's toes. Number 7, the atypical business practice of not making Chapek a member of the board of directors after becoming CEO. Number 8, Disney's board given no opportunity to assess Chapek's qualifications to become CEO. And finally, number 9, Chapek's blind trust in Iger as all of the above was occurring. And before proceeding with the next subsection in the expose, I will add a 10th red flag. Number 10, the Disney board's complete abdication of its responsibilities to both the employees and shareholders in favor of doing everything that Iger wanted. The 5th subsection of the expose is entitled Iger's Lapdog. Paraphrasing, on board Disney's private Gulfstream jet for a 4.5-hour flight from Los Angeles to Raleigh, North Carolina, which was the site of that year's investors meeting, Chapek had expected that the time would be used as an extended preparation session ahead of the meeting. But that doesn't appear to be what happened. Iger became more interested in talking about photos on his iPad, which included ones with Paul McCartney and his yacht. Frustrated, Chapek moved to the back of the plane to study binders containing company financial data. Some on the same flight have claimed that Chapek got up and went to the back of the plane without recalling the iPad session with Iger. But Chapek's absence became noticeable when Iger asked Christine McCarthy, Zinnia Muka, and Alan Braverman whether Chapek wanted to be briefed or not. So Iger went to the back of the plane to find Chapek, who was more interested in studying the binders, which made Iger feel like he had made a huge mistake because apparently Chapek wasn't just another yes man like the rest of his rubber-stamping board of directors. So let's chalk that up as red flag number 11. Additionally, California's Governor Gavin Newsom called Iger about restricting public gatherings, but didn't want to close Disneyland to avoid creating a possible panic. Iger told Newsom that it would be better to close Disneyland too, and Chapek agreed, but was furious because Iger had excluded him from the conversation, which had nothing to do with Iger's creative mandate. So let's chalk that up as red flag number 12, because Iger was continuing to act like he was still the CEO and not operating within the bounds of his creative mandate as he was supposed to be doing. Then when Disney executives worried about the shock that the park closures would have on the company's cash flow, Christine McCarthy and Chapek made the decision to quickly furlough, albeit with health benefits, more than 90,000 employees at the theme parks. But then, guess what happened next? Iger overruled them because he decided to wait until the government passed a Coup relief bill. 2 months earlier, when Chapek and Iger had appeared together on CNBC, Iger brushed aside a question about the potential for confusion over who was in charge. Quote, Bob is going to be running the company, unquote, Iger said, but now it seemed to Chapek that Iger was acting as though nothing had changed. Iger was still chief executive in all but name. Chapek's wife told him that he was little more than Iger's lapdog. And this next subsection is entitled, He's Killing Me, and I'm sure you can guess who said that. However marginalized Chapek felt, the two maintained at least a facade of cooperation. Because of the coup, no one went into the office, but Chapek spoke to Iger weekly by phone and sometimes went to see him at his Brentwood home, but Iger never went to see Chapek at his home in Westlake Village. At Chapek's request, the two held a series of employee town hall meetings where Iger was supposed to reinforce the message that Chapek was now in charge. Quote, my goal is for Bob to be successful, and to the extent that I can help him do that, I will, unquote, Iger said at the first town hall that they held in February of 2020. Quote, I think it's got to be a balance between giving him the freedom to make the decisions and do things the way he wants to do them because, they feel right to him. On the other hand, I've got a fair amount of experience doing a lot of these things. And it's not quite about throwing him into a swimming pool when he's never swum. So it'll be a balance, unquote. But nearly everything Chapek did or didn't do only reinforced Iger's sense that naming Chapek as his successor had been a huge mistake. Here are a couple of questions that I have at this point. First, did Iger ever attempt to mentor Chapek in any way regarding how he had been running Disney, how the different divisions operated, or what had led him to make some of the decisions that he had made in the past? Second, did Iger make any efforts to introduce Chapek to important people in Hollywood so that he could begin to build up a rapport with them and come to understand them? Since nothing in this expose has led me to believe that the answers to either of those questions might be yes, I think it's safe to say that the answer to both is a resounding no. So when Iger says that he made a huge mistake, the less effort that he made to actually assist Chapek into becoming a fully qualified Disney CEO actually places more of the blame onto himself than onto Chapek. It's not like anyone can just run over to the nearest bookstore and find a self-help book on how to be a good Disney CEO. And I think that the best evidence that Iger wasn't assisting Chapek was what happened next, which only made things far worse between the two of them than they already were. And mind you, Chapek had only been Disney's CEO for less than 2 months at that point in time. Iger began to express his frustrations with his friends in Hollywood. And naturally, the word spread. And then someone contacted the New York Times media columnist at the time, Ben Smith, to say Iger was reasserting control. So Smith called and spoke to Iger too, who followed up with an email. So instead of making an effort to speak with Chapek privately or with trusted members of the board who might have been able to assist, Iger went to the press. And in all likelihood, he either never considered what the personal impact on Chapek might be or on their professional relationship, or he was deliberately attempting to publicly sabotage Chapek's position. Paraphrasing, Chapek was hosting a party on Sunday, April 12, 2020, with family and friends to celebrate his promotion, but then a friend emailed Chapek a copy of Smith's column. Stepping outside to read it, Chapek was stunned in disbelief at what Smith had written. quote, "After a few weeks of letting Chapek take charge, Iger smoothly reasserted control," unquote, and referred to Chapek as, quote, "the new nominal chief executive," unquote, and speculated that the choice of Iger's successor, quote, "may be open again," unquote. Smith quoted Iger as saying in an email that, quote, "a crisis of this magnitude and its impact on Disney would necessarily result in my actively helping Bob and the company contend with it, particularly since I ran the company for 15 years, unquote. Paraphrasing, Chapek called communications executive Xenia Muka asking, quote, "What the hell is this?" unquote, with her trying to calm him down and arguing that the column wasn't that bad. Well, since it wasn't about her, it was easy for her to say something like that, and she's probably an Iger loyalist. I can only imagine that Chapek must have felt completely humiliated and demoralized. Who wouldn't be in that situation? "He's killing me," Chapek responded. Chapek didn't sleep that night, and early the next morning, he confronted Iger on the phone, where Iger denied that he had spoken to Smith, which only further enraged Chapek, who pointed out that Iger's quote came directly from an email. So Iger lied to Chapek, just as he has lied to many others, including to George Lucas back in 2012 when he bought Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise from Lucas. And do you recall what my 9th red flag was in part 1 that I mentioned earlier in this video? Chapek's blind trust in Iger. Lucas got screwed over by Iger just like Chapek did 8 years later. Iger said that he didn't understand why Chapek was so upset. What was wrong with saying he was reasserting control in the midst of a crisis? "You've cut my legs out from under me," Chapek said. "I've never felt worse in my life." The conversation then became heated and both men raised their voices. Iger told several people immediately afterward that he'd never been treated with more disrespect by anyone in his entire life. Yet it was perfectly okay for him to publicly disrespect others, including Chapek, his personally handpicked successor. Iger either completely failed to grasp that his comments to the press effectively said that Chapek, who was supposed to be the CEO, wasn't actually qualified to make difficult decisions for the company, or Iger was deliberately sabotaging Chapek. Either way, Iger is always hyper-focused on his own public image and his incredibly high opinion of himself, which doesn't leave a lot of room for him to be empathetic towards others. He had manipulated Chapek and the board to make Chapek CEO, but when it came to actual decisions that Chapek would need to make as CEO, Iger overstepped him, and in that moment, yeah, I could totally empathize with why Chapek felt as bad as he did, but not the high and mighty, egotistical Bob Iger. And given the immense trust that Chapek had placed in Iger up to that moment, it seems likely that part of what made Chapek so upset was his realization that he could never trust Iger again. And losing Chapek's trust was clearly not on Iger's egotistical mind, because how did he react? So as far as Iger was concerned, his relationship with Chapek was over. So because Chapek wouldn't just roll over and allow Iger to publicly humiliate him at will, Iger decided that his relationship with Chapek was over. Who in their right mind would want to work for a company like this? But moving on to the next subsection entitled "This Too Shall Pass," paraphrasing, Disney's Chief Human Resources Officer Jane Parker alerted Disney's directors at 6 a.m. on the following Monday, and the enraged Chapek got on the phone with Susan Arnold, with whom he felt he had developed a good rapport. But Arnold was taken aback by the vehemence of Chapek's reaction to the column and thought that he seemed paranoid that Iger was out to destroy him, and urged him to calm down and to defer to Iger as she had advised before. The problem here, though, is that deferring to Iger was something that Chapek could no longer do because he no longer trusted Iger. "What will be left of my reputation?" Chapek pleaded. "This too shall pass," she responded, because Iger would be gone in 20 months, and the CEO prize would be Chapek's alone. At this point, Susan Arnold clearly didn't yet grasp the gravity of the situation that Iger had created by publicly humiliating Chapek, but that was about to change. Then Chapek all but begged to be named to the board as a show of confidence in him. So Arnold conferred with several other directors, and none of them were aware of the depth of the hostility that had developed between Iger and his designated successor. But they agreed that it could damage his standing. So the board felt that it then had no choice but to name Chapek a director as a show of support. And Arnold called Iger and chastised him for the column, telling him that it was the worst thing that could have happened to Chapek. She also pointed out that had Iger taken the board's suggestion to initially name Chapek Chief Operating Officer rather than Chief Executive, that none of this would be happening. But in any event, the sniping between them had to stop. And how did Iger react to Susan Arnold? He was taken aback by both the tone and substance of Arnold's call, because she seemed to be siding with Chapek, even though he had been CEO for less than 2 months, and Iger was still ultimately in charge. So as far as Iger was concerned, she and other board members should be happy that he was stepping back up during a crisis, especially when Chapek's leadership had been so lackluster. So in other words, Iger, who can only view the world in terms of himself, was far more concerned in having Arnold's and the board's blind loyalty to himself. Naturally, we have to chalk this up as the 13th red flag, Iger's personal view that he's always right and that everyone else should just do what he says. But on April 15th, 3 days after Smith's column was published, Chapek was named to Disney's board. Now, the Exposé doesn't describe Iger's reaction to Chapek being named to Disney's board of directors, but I strongly suspect that he was probably both angry and unapologetic about what he had said in the April 12, 2020 column in the New York Times that had ultimately resulted in this positive change to Chapek's status, which was an outcome that Iger had probably not anticipated, especially if he had attempted to sabotage Chapek through the column. And the board wasn't just showing their support for Chapek to the general public, they were also showing it to Disney's employees and to Iger. It was a rare moment when the board wasn't acting as Iger's rubber stamp and had finally found at least some courage to stand up to Iger. Paraphrasing, in June, the board scheduled private video call sessions with both men to address the conflict, with Iger complaining about Chapek's leadership, that he hadn't sought Iger's advice and counsel, and that Chapek had no standing within the creative community, which he hadn't tried to improve, claiming that Chapek had skipped meetings that Iger had invited him to. Chapek said that he was sorry that their differences had become a board issue. But he was incensed when Mark Parker, the board member who had led Nike, questioned Chapek's lack of contacts in the Hollywood creative community, since that was supposed to be Iger's jurisdiction. He insisted that he hadn't skipped meetings, but rather that Iger had scheduled them without telling him. Chapek said Iger had ceded little authority, something Chapek said that he had accepted without complaining. "I was just trying to be a good soldier," Chapek said. But the board's message to both men was that the company was in crisis and that they needed to start acting like adults and work together. Both Iger and Chapek were defensive, and neither was being completely honest. While I don't believe that Chapek had completely rejected Iger's advice and counsel, he had certainly lost trust in Iger, and Chapek had complained when he was excluded from conversations with Governor Gavin Newsom and when Iger was reasserting control, as reported in the New York Times column. As to Chapek's lack of contacts within the creative community, that's going to come up in part 3 of this video series. Now, at the same time, the board was also starting to question Chapek's qualifications to be CEO after the fact. Later, in an audit committee board session with Christine McCarthy, Safra Katz, who was the board member who had questioned Chapek's readiness, questioned her if she thought Chapek was up to the job. McCarthy, the chief financial officer, didn't immediately answer. "I don't like the fact that you're hesitating," Katz said. "I'm giving you a qualified answer," McCarthy said. "If he will start to listen, if he will listen, we're all trying to help him, but he doesn't listen." If Chapek wasn't actually qualified to be CEO, whose fault was it that he was? Bob Chapek had not appointed himself to be CEO. Bob Iger and his rubber-stamping board of directors had. In the ensuing months, Iger seemed increasingly cranky about the board's reaction to Smith's column. "You mean because Iger's typical rubber-stamping board of directors had defended Chapek and put him onto the board? Why are you so hostile toward the board?" Chapek finally asked during one of their calls, which had continued despite the tensions. Iger told him that he couldn't handle the truth, and then proceeded to say that before the board had agreed to name Chapek chief executive, the directors had assured Iger that if he didn't think it was working out, he could fire Chapek and return as chief executive anytime he wanted.
I am the Senate.
Ellen Davis, a spokeswoman for Chapek, confirmed that account. She said Chapek, quote, "was shocked and surprised when told by Iger that he believed he could have his job back if and when he wanted it," unquote. Immediately after the call, Chapek called Susan Arnold and asked, "What is he talking about?" And Arnold tried to make light of it, saying, "Well, you know Bob, he may think so, but just let it go." Isn't it interesting how any time that Iger creates a new problem, Chapek is always told to just let it go or something similar by a board member? It wasn't the answer Chapek was hoping for. David Jefferson, the Disney spokesman, said there was never any such understanding between Iger and the board. The claim that he could return at will was not something Iger would have said, Jefferson added. Unless he was there during the conversation that occurred between Iger and Chapek, he wouldn't actually know, so he's just repeating what he was told to say. But for Chapek, this was a turning point. It wasn't just paranoia. He was now convinced that Iger was trying to get rid of him and return as chief executive, and that the board might let him. Let's be honest, how would you feel if someone was trying to get you fired from your job, and it's the same person who had helped you to get the job in the first place? You'd undoubtedly be upset because that's the natural reaction. But as I said earlier in the video, while Iger is clearly responsible for creating this entire situation, so is Disney's rubber-stamping board of directors who totally enabled him to do it. Chapek isn't completely blameless though, and that will become more apparent in part 3. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.